We can get this thing going.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Right. Yeah, just want to make sure that I knew the timing so that I knew what to omit. All right. Thank you.
you're welcome.
What happens when we begin to realize that the 200-year experiment we've called the American healthcare system has failed? Tune in to Awakened Wellness with Mylaine Riobe, MD, and join the conversation about how to heal our broken system to reverse our current health crisis. The entire world is looking for answers, and the truth is hidden in plain sight. Learn how spirituality, ancient traditions, and cutting-edge science are merging to create a new paradigm of wellness every Wednesday at 12 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Time with live video shows every first and third Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, when you can call in and ask the questions that matter most to you.
And we're live.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, and welcome to Awakened Wellness. I'm Dr. Mylaine Riobe, and I'm your host today. We are live doing a show on the important and ignored relationship between COVID and sickle cell trait. It's clear that people of color, whether they be African Americans, Latin Americans, Native Americans, are experiencing higher hospitalization rates, death rates, and in some cases, higher infection rates than the general population during this crisis. And there are many, many reasons for that that we'll be talking about today. One of them, of course, is the socioeconomic issue that people of color have faced in this country for 5 centuries. However, there are other factors that we need to look at that I believe if we continue to ignore them, this community of people will continue to suffer needlessly. There are things that we can immediately intervene in and correct so that socioeconomic disparities don't impact them as much. So when COVID first came out, about 25% of people who were hospitalized were dying. There was no medical care really available for COVID. The methods that we would normally use were failing, they were not working. And when we began to analyze the death rates, we saw that 5 times the number of people of color were dying of COVID than their counterparts in the Caucasian and white communities. And of course, immediately the topic went to socioeconomic disparities with good reason, because that is very true. But something that we keep ignoring that has got to come into the conversation are the other factors. There are other factors that just make us in the African American and Latin American community just different than our counterparts in the Caucasian demographic. You know, not as a judgment, not to make us better or worse, but just genetics are genetics. You know, we have a different set of genes than other demographics. People of European descent have different genes than people of Asian descent. People of Asian descent have different genes than people of African descent, and that's just the way it is. And with the development of genomics, genetics, especially the past decade or so, we're beginning to understand that these genetic differences do make a difference in terms of how we respond to environmental insults, how we respond to stress. and how we combat disease and how we prevent disease. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. There's a link between COVID deaths and sickle cell trait that I'd like to explore that has just been ignored for far too long in the medical community. So we'd love to hear from you. Our call-in number here on Dream Vision 7 Radio is area code 646-558-8656. Our meeting ID is 883-695-3587. And if you'd like to raise your hand to make a comment or ask a question, please hit *9. We'll be happy to hear from you and to hear any comments you may have and answer any questions that I can answer for you. So I am a double board certified medical doctor. I'm from New York originally, and I'm here in Jupiter, Florida now for the past 20 years. I am board certified in OB-GYN, as well as the exciting new field of integrative medicine, which was accepted in 2014 by the American Board of Physician Specialties as a formal medical specialty. In order to be accepted as a formal medical specialty, a field has to have an overwhelming body of evidence that it's useful and that it works. And integrative medicine was more than able to show that it works. And so it was officially recognized in 2014. I was blessed to obtain my board certification in 2017 in integrative medicine and OB-GYN back in 2003. And the reason I was able to really start looking at this link between sickle cell trait and COVID is because of my OB-GYN training. So most people are familiar with sickle cell disease. You know, sickle cell disease is a devastating genetic disorder that tends to affect African Americans more than any other demographic. Sickle cell disease is a debilitating genetic disorder that occurs when a child gets a gene from each parent for sickle cell trait. So of course, when you're born, you have inherited the genes of your mother and your father. And if your mother and your father both have sickle cell trait, and you inherit both of those genes from both sides, you will then inherit what's called sickle cell disease. And that's a true genetic disorder that you can't avoid, unfortunately. So people with sickle cell disease tend to have shortened lifespans. They have sickle crises, which are debilitating, painful crises. They tend to have very poor circulation, heart disease, kidney failure, and they tend not to have a life expectancy that's as long as those not impacted by sickle cell disease. So sickle cell disease is very well recognized in the medical community. You know, when one of our patients came in as an obstetrics and gynecology resident and physician after graduation, we treated those clients as very high risk clients during their pregnancies because they were at risk, not just for death themselves, but also what we called fetal demise. Their baby could die before birth. They could have sickle crises, they could have high blood pressure and all kinds of complications during their pregnancies. So we treated those clients very differently than the general obstetrical population. Sickle cell trait is different. Sickle cell trait is you only have one mutated gene from either of your parents. And so you don't have what's termed sickle cell anemia or disease, but you have what's termed sickle cell trait. In my opinion, we don't pay enough attention to sickle cell trait in the medical community. And if you look up sickle cell trait, you won't really find any studies on it. You won't really find any information about it, except to the extent that you'll be told that it's when you have one copy of a mutated gene for sickle cell. And that it's otherwise known to be benign. People have a normal life expectancy if they have sickle cell trait. Well, I would beg to differ with that. I would greatly beg to differ with that. I don't think that's the case at all. And the reason I don't think it's the case is because it's not studied. We have a really bad habit in the medical community of stating that if something's not studied, it's not happening. And so we tend to fight back and say, well, there are no studies to show that. But meanwhile, we haven't looked for any studies to show it. We haven't done any studies to show it. And then we just blanketly shove it aside and say, you know, it's not studied, so therefore it's not a problem. It is a problem. People with sickle cell trait in obstetrics and gynecology, when a woman with sickle cell trait, and again, remember, that's just one, you know, sickle gene, mutated gene, are high risk. We consider women with sickle cell trait in obstetrics to be at high risk because they can still have crises. They can still develop urinary tract infections, which can induce preterm labor. Their babies can grow abnormally and be of small size. There is still a risk of fetal demise in patients with sickle cell trait. And so in the obstetrics community, we understand that it's a high risk situation, but yet in the rest of the medical community, or when that patient is no longer pregnant, all of a sudden we pretend like nothing's the matter anymore. So we have to go to the international medical literature to find more information about sickle cell trait. You won't find it in American journals. In fact, I had to comb through the internet looking for any studies on sickle cell trait, and I had to find them in other countries like Brazil and Africa. They're not really found here. We just kind of shove it under the rug and we keep moving. And I think that's causing us a lot of harm, especially in the communities, people of color. Up to 10% of African Americans have sickle cell trait. Up to 5% of Latin Americans have sickle cell trait. I was just looking up a study in India, the Indian Journal of Medical Research, and in looking at the devastation that's occurring from COVID-19 in India at the moment, I was wondering, what is the rate of sickle cell trait in India? And this particular journal says that it's up to 35% in certain areas in India. And so this link between sickle cell trait and COVID is not one that's easy to track. And so the reason it's important is I believe that African Americans who have sickle cell trait, Latin Americans who have sickle cell trait, people of Mediterranean descent also have sickle cell trait. Italians, Greeks have sickle cell trait. And of course, Africans, in particular from the regions of Benin, the Congo, have sickle cell trait. And I believe these people are at high risk for death from COVID. And I believe it is one of the reasons that we're seeing an up to 2 times or 3 times mortality rate in people of color as compared to Caucasians. In the Caucasian community, we still have about 3% sickle cell trait rate. And in fact, about 3 million Americans, regardless of their demographic background, have sickle cell trait and they don't know it. It's not tested for. And in fact, medical societies have objected to people being screened for sickle cell trait, which I found shocking. The NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, mandated sickle cell screening back in 2010 due to a series of deaths of athletes, sudden deaths, otherwise extremely healthy people, young athletes who suddenly died. And they were determined to be carriers of sickle cell trait. And so the NCAA decided to mandate sickle cell trait screening for all athletes. And they were vehemently opposed by the American Society of Hematologists, who are a collection of about 16,000 medical doctors. And I understand why they were opposed to a certain extent. We don't want to bring about any conditions of discrimination potentially. However, we can't ignore a medical condition that needs to be identified and treated. And so it was shocking to me that the NCAA would recognize an at-risk medical condition before the medical community would, and implement mandated testing. And the reason they wanted to do it is because people with sickle cell trait require different care, require different preventive strategies than people who don't have sickle cell trait. And it's just logic, right? It's playing dot to dots, like I like to say. So what's the link between sickle cell trait and COVID, and why should it matter here? For those of you who listened to a couple podcasts ago, when I talked about post-COVID syndrome, I looked at the mechanism of how COVID reproduces in the human body. And this was told to us by Chinese engineers back in March of 2020. They released a study based on bioinformatics. And bioinformatics is very sophisticated software where you can put the genetic information of a virus or anything really. And then you can kind of make three-dimensional models of the proteins that the genes of the virus would make. And from that, you can calculate what the virus would attach to, what medications might be effective against the virus, how the virus might attach and enter the body, how the virus might reproduce itself. And it's a very fascinating technology. So these engineers in China used this particular software, and they pretty much mapped out how COVID was going to work. And when we fast forward now over a year later, we're starting to see that what they predicted based on their bioinformatics genetics information is quite accurate. So what they said back then and what we know now is that COVID enters the body through the lungs, through the ACE2 receptors of lung cells. Once it gets into the body, into the bloodstream, it wants to find its way into a red blood cell so that it can attack our hemoglobin molecules. Hemoglobin is what carries oxygen throughout the human body. So there's no cell that doesn't need oxygen in our bodies. And so red blood cells go through our entire bodies and access all of our cells. So that pretty much gives the virus access to any cell in the body that it wants by, hitching a ride on a red blood cell. The red blood cells are the cells that carry the oxygen. So they're actually what make our blood look red because of the oxygen that they carry. And so once the virus is there, the reason it wants our hemoglobin is because it needs it to reproduce itself. And so what COVID does is it breaks apart hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a very intricate protein that has four different proteins bound together. And in between, in the middle, is what's called a porphyrin ring. And on the porphyrin ring is an iron molecule, which is a mineral. And the iron holds the oxygen. And that's the delivery system of oxygen throughout the entire body. And so COVID wants the porphyrin ring that's in the middle of the hemoglobin molecule, and it has devised an excellent way to break the hemoglobin apart so it can grab the porphyrin. And so what happens when the hemoglobin molecule is broken apart is that the iron becomes unstable and it becomes free floating, and the oxygen becomes unstable and it becomes free floating. Free floating iron and oxygen are extremely toxic, and our bodies can't use it when it's in that form. The other thing that happens is the hemoglobin molecule now gets broken apart. And there's a particular other section of the hemoglobin molecule called heme. Heme is critical because the higher your heme levels, the more susceptible you are to virus infections. And so this was determined by a journal early on. I was doing some research. The Pan-African Medical Journal looked at sickle cell trait, and the more heme you have, in particular, if there's no oxygen associated with the heme, the more susceptible you are to virus infections. So breaking apart the hemoglobin molecule weakens your immune system and makes you actually more susceptible to viruses. So people with sickle cell trait, the reason this is important is sickle cell trait is a red blood cell disorder. It's a hemoglobin disorder. And people with sickle cell trait, their red blood cells are slightly deformed, or what we call sickled. So it actually looks like a sickle. So it's not the regular shape of a red blood cell, which is somewhat ovular. It becomes almost like a bowl. So it's a sickle shape. It's literally called what it looks like. And it's very difficult for sickled red blood cells to carry oxygen, which is what creates the problem in people with sickle cell trait and disease. So even when you have just the trait and you don't have sickle cell disease or anemia, you still have deformed red blood cells. And because the red blood cells are deformed, you have higher heme levels because they're more destroyed by the body. The body is very well able to identify cells that are abnormal and kill them, to get rid of them. And so these sickled red blood cells are more rapidly destroyed by the body. And so we have this dissociation of hemoglobin occurring in sickle cell trait more so than in people who don't have sickle cell trait. And so they have higher heme levels than the general population. And so COVID loves that because now they can access hemoglobin much more easily and get to the porphyrin molecule, which is what they want. And so people with higher heme levels are more susceptible to COVID. And if you look at the other populations that we now know are more susceptible to COVID, they also have higher heme levels. So men tend to have higher hemoglobin levels than women. That's very well known in medicine. Partly because they don't menstruate like women do, so they don't lose blood. So their hemoglobin levels tend to be higher. And that's why men are more likely to die of COVID than women. Children have much lower hemoglobin levels than adults in general. And so that's why we're seeing that COVID doesn't impact children as much as it impacts adults. There are other viruses that impact children more than adults because they use mechanisms that are different than COVID. So this helps to explain why COVID has spared children more so than adults. It helps to explain why COVID has spared women as compared to men. It also explains why people with diabetes are more susceptible to death from COVID because people with diabetes have higher hemoglobin levels. Generally speaking, people who have conditions that would make their circulation more poor. So we know that people with diabetes and heart disease and people with high blood pressure tend to have higher hemoglobin levels because the body is trying to compensate for the fact that it can't oxygenate itself as well. Diabetics don't oxygenate themselves as well as non-diabetics. And so the body will make more hemoglobin as a means of trying to carry more oxygen around. So people with diabetes will have higher hemoglobin levels. We see that when we measure what's called hemoglobin A1C in diabetics. It's a measure of blood sugar control. So diabetics have more free-floating hemoglobin, and that hemoglobin, because sugar is so sticky, it sticks to the hemoglobin, and we call that glycosylated hemoglobin. Or hemoglobin A1C, and that's a measure of blood sugar control. People with high blood pressure have higher hemoglobin levels for the same reason. People with high blood pressure can't oxygenate themselves as well, and so their bodies will compensate and try and make more hemoglobin to oxygenate them better. And so people with heart disease, people with hypertension, we're seeing that they're more susceptible to COVID for that reason. Now, we haven't made the direct link to hemoglobin yet, which we should have had we listened to the engineers from China a year ago. And had we listened to them a year ago, we may have also identified at least one factor that is creating a higher mortality rate in our African American, Latino, and Indian communities and Caribbean communities. We may have identified that a little bit sooner. And had we put people with sickle cell trait in a high risk category, we may have been able to save some lives. So again, we're seeing that sickle cell trait is just not studied. And again, I think it's doing a disservice to everyone when we claim that because something's not studied, it's not happening. And so the reason that the American Society of Hematologists opposed the NCAA back in 2010, and they actually published a position paper on this in 2012 expressing their opposition to testing athletes for sickle cell trait. And they said that one of the reasons they cited was because there's no evidence to suggest that sickle cell trait is a problem. Well, there's no evidence to suggest that sickle cell trait is a problem because we haven't tried to find the evidence. But if we look in the international medical literature, we can find the evidence. You know, there are studies internationally that show that people with sickle cell trait are at higher risk for sudden death from exercise. People with sickle cell trait are at higher risk for kidney disease and kidney failure. You know, they are at higher risk for lung diseases, right? So we know COVID affects the lungs. We know people with sickle cell trait have higher incidence of lung disease. And so, you know, a collaboration really needs to happen internationally. We really need to start looking at what are other countries up to, you know, and if we look and if we collaborate, we'll see that in certain respects, they're leaps and bounds ahead of us here in the United States. You know, the cancer treatments in Europe are leaps and bounds ahead of what we have here in the United States. The research that's done internationally can only help us here in the United States. You know, had we looked at the study by these Chinese engineers and tried to duplicate it in our own labs, you know, we would have known more earlier about COVID. We would have been able to protect the African American community a little bit more. So what do we know about sickle cell trait? You know, we know that because they're not able to carry oxygen as efficiently, they are at risk for issues that have to do with poor oxygenation. Of course, your immune system relies on oxygen, right? Everything, your heart relies on oxygen, your lungs rely on oxygen, your liver relies on oxygen, your brain. There's not a cell in your body that doesn't rely on oxygen to function and fuel itself. And so when you have a condition that makes it difficult for you to use your oxygen, you're going to be at risk under undue stress, right? There will be, you'll be more susceptible to stress than someone who doesn't have that problem. And so what can people with sickle cell trait do? Well, we know if you drop your hemoglobin level, you'll be a little safer, right? So how do you drop the hemoglobin levels? Aside from, you know, the bloodletting that used to be done a couple hundred years ago with leeches, but, you know, you can hydrate yourself better, right? So drinking water, just the simple act of drinking water drops hemoglobin levels. And in fact, in the medical community, when someone has a higher than expected hemoglobin level, we know that they're dehydrated in part. And we always advise them to drink more water. And that dilutes the hemoglobin and it helps them to drop their hemoglobin level, and it helps them to oxygenate themselves, you know, much, much better, which is always better for everyone to be more hydrated. You know, when you drink more water, you can oxygenate yourself better. When you oxygenate yourself better, you can make more energy to run your metabolism. When you make more energy to run your metabolism, your whole body functions better. So these are some of the lessons we can learn to help us look at things a little bit more differently. You know, this idea of being isolationist, this idea of if we don't figure it out ourselves, then it's not happening. This idea that if we didn't study it, it's not real, really needs to just go away. It's not helpful. It's not safe. COVID has shown us in no uncertain terms that we are not as healthy as we think we are. You know, if the international literature didn't show us that before, it should be showing it to us now. We are the unhealthiest, richest country on the planet. You know, the healthcare in Europe is far more superior than the healthcare that we get here. And that's based on all kinds of international studies done. You know, so this isolationist movement that we're experiencing and that we have been experiencing for a long time is it's just not good for us. It's causing us a lot of distress, undue suffering. We have got to look at what other countries are up to, share and collaborate information. If we do that, we'll know a lot more. We'll be able to move forward a lot more. Pandemics don't know borders. You might have to show a passport to go from, the United States to Canada, but a toxin doesn't require a passport to go from the United States to Canada. Arsenic doesn't need a passport to come across the Atlantic Ocean, from anywhere to here. A virus doesn't need a passport. It doesn't need a visa. It just goes where it wants. And so we have to understand that, there are no borders on the planet. These are all artificial concepts that we've constructed, which is fine. And I understand why they're constructed. There's a need for that. But we can't just have that be what we do across the board for everything. We cannot solve the COVID crisis on our own. We cannot protect ourselves from pandemics on our own, right? We have to understand that what anyone does, whether they're doing it in Alaska or Guam or anywhere at all, Russia, China, Australia, New York City, Los Angeles, it's going to affect us wherever we are. It may not affect us right away, but it will affect us eventually. So when we come back from this commercial break, we'll talk about the link between sickle cell trait and COVID and what we can do here in the United States to begin to better understand what is causing this and what we can do about it to help to reduce the burden on the segments of our population that need our help the most. We'll be right back.
What happens when we begin to realize that the 200-year experiment we've called the American healthcare system has failed? Learn how spirituality, ancient traditions, and cutting-edge science are merging to create a new paradigm of wellness on Awakened Wellness with Mylaine Riobe, MD. Tune in every Wednesday at 12 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Time with live video shows every first and third Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern, when you can call in and ask Dr. Mylaine the questions that matter most to you. Dr. Mylaine is the medical director of the Riobe Institute of Integrative Medicine in Jupiter, Florida. For more information, visit RIOBE integrativemedicine.com. Dream Vision 7 Radio Network invites you in for this dynamic, forward-thinking show.
Join Dr. Bernie Siegel on Mind Health Matters every Thursday and Friday, 12 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Time on syndicated Dream Vision 7 Radio Network. Bernie will draw from his inspirational personal journey, offering us special nuggets of his sacred wisdom weaved through his delightful stories. Listen in as Bernie reminds us to be fully engaged in life.
Ever wonder what it's like to have your own radio show? Well, wonder no longer, because you can dip into the radio airwaves by being host for the day on syndicated Dream Vision 7 Radio Network. It's a fabulous way to get your radio feet wet. It's an opportunity to market your business, modality, or book. Have a guest, mention a sponsor, and take callers. Or you may want to facilitate a lesson by going solo. It's up to you. Listeners can be online, mobile, in cars with Bluetooth, or listen through Amazon's Echo by asking, Alexa, play Dream Vision 7 Radio Network. For more details, go to dreamvision7radio.com and click on Host for the Day.
Omega Institute, offering workshops, retreats, and online learning dedicated to awakening the best in the human spirit. For over 40 years, Omega has seen more than 1 million people come through its doors to grow, learn, and find a greater sense of purpose. With over 350 workshops to choose from, Omega offers something for everyone. Located in Rhinebeck, New York, just 90 miles north of New York City, Omega's natural environment and quiet pace allow for extraordinary experiences to unfold. Learn more at eomega.org or call 877-944-2002. Again, 877-944-2002.
Delight your kids with an enchanting journey by reading the Paper Doll Kids children's book by Deborah Beauvais and Janine Sullivan. There's even a catchy tune, Kids for Love Song, produced by Bob Sherwood and sung by kids just like yours. The story weaves around 7 paper dolls flying around the world doing good deeds as they bring important attention to our endangered animal friends. There's even a magical ring with a universal message. Kids become interested in service projects, action through compassion, and planting seeds that nurture positive change. The Paper Doll Kids and Kids for Love Song are a production of the Kids for Love Project. Get the book now on Amazon Kindle and the song on CD Baby or iTunes.
This is Dream Vision 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax, and enjoy. Let life flow.
We're back.
Thank you, Rachel. Any questions out there?
No, I'm afraid, and questions, but we do have a lot of listeners on the radio station, so we're doing well.
Okay.
And I find the subject very informative.
Okay,
I know
perfect.
podcast will be the same.
Yeah, I'm just, I can't quite see when there are questions, so just interrupt me. Thank you. All right, welcome back to Dream Vision 7 Radio. This is Awakened Wellness with Dr. Mylaine Riobe, and we're going on an eye-opening, mind-expanding adventure into disease prevention and wellness. We are debunking myths and looking at ways that you and your family can stay healthy and happy during this difficult time in our history. So today we are talking about the link between sickle cell trait and COVID and how it may be impacting our brothers and sisters in the African-American, Latino, Indian, Southeast Asian, and African communities. You know, and no one has been spared from COVID is the bottom line, you know, unfortunately, because globally we have weakened our immune system. Globally, we have been inundated with toxins since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution a couple hundred years ago. And so no one is really safe, you know, and we can't protect ourselves from pollution and toxins, right? You know, we think that we're in a particular corner on the globe, you know, and we're somehow protected, but, you know, the earth is rotating on its axis at 1,000 miles an hour, you know, and so we're sharing this air, you know, at a very rapid rate. So the clouds that are over your head today are thousands of miles away, you know, in a few days. And so the toxins that they're carrying in the air, you know, are going to be raining down on you at some point. So, you know, we cannot think of COVID as an isolated thing. We're going to close our borders. We're going to prevent travel. Or, you know, we're going to do this and that. Not that we don't have to do that in case of emergency. You know, we've had to do it, but we have to start really looking at why did we have to do that? You know, what is a better way of looking at this? And we have to begin to understand that we live on one planet. It may be divided into countries and states and continents, but we live on one planet. You know, we breathe the same air, we drink the same water. You know, the medications that get flushed into a toilet bowl in Canada end up in Asia at some point, right? So we have to begin to understand that this is a global issue that requires global cooperation, right? You know, and we're a little bit slow here in the United States because our medical system has become an institution. And it's not a nimble system, right? It's a very entrenched dogmatic system. It's not nimble. It's not quick on its feet. We require data before we want to change anything. And again, this argument about sickle cell trait that I have with the medical community, they're waiting for studies, but nobody's conducting any studies, right? And so it's been decades, we're waiting for studies, but no one will study it. So what could have happened when the NCAA decided to test all athletes for sickle cell trait? Let's imagine a scenario, right? The American Society of Hematologists could have said, well, let's take this as an opportunity to study this condition. We're going to have thousands of people tested for sickle cell trait. Let's see, what we can learn from this. But instead, again, they opposed it. I think they may have even have sued them. I don't remember. Don't quote me on that one, but I know they formally opposed it and they came out with a position paper in opposition in 2012. The NCAA still went about its business and it's continuing to test its athletes because it wants to protect its athletes. But we could have studied it, right? We have thousands of people now being studied to see if they have sickle cell trait. Let's follow them. Let's enroll them in medical studies. Let's see what happens. Do they have an increased rate of heart disease when they're 50? Do they, do they need to drink more water? Do they need to sleep more? Do they need to do certain things differently? Why not use that as an opportunity rather than saying, you know what, we don't have any studies to confirm what you're doing, so we oppose what you're doing. Why not collaborate? You have a golden opportunity, collaborate. But we don't do that. I don't know why we don't do it. It's very mysterious to me why we're so dogmatic, why we don't want to hear other people's information. Had we listened to the Chinese engineers, we would be so far ahead right now. India might have been a little better prepared. We might have been a little better prepared. We have quite a bit of sickle cell trait here in the United States. 3 million Americans have sickle cell trait. Not only that, but if we keep playing dot to dots with sickle cell trait, it's probably the reason African Americans have 2 to 3 times more risk of death from cancer than their Caucasian counterparts. It's probably the reason African Americans have, not the only reason, so let me not phrase it that way, a significant reason. I won't say it's the only reason. We do have tremendous socioeconomic disparities in this country, but those are not the only reasons. There are actual medically founded reasons, and I believe one of them is sickle cell trait. I believe it almost doesn't matter where you look. African Americans are more likely to die of cancer than their white counterparts. African Americans are more likely to have hypertension. They're more likely to have diabetes. They're more likely to have heart attacks. And yes, we can say it's because maybe they don't have the same amount of access to care. But if we really look at our healthcare system, it's not preventive. So even if they had access to care, it wouldn't prevent them from getting those conditions, right? And it might help them treat it once they got it, but it wouldn't help prevent it. So the fact that they're getting these diseases at a higher rate tells us it's not just lack of access to care. It's something else. It's several other things. So sickle cell trait is just one thing. It could be a lot of other things, but we need to find out. We need to look, right? If we keep saying it's not studied, so let's ignore it, and nobody ever studies it, when are we ever going to find out? But I suspect it's a significant reason why the African Americans, Latin Americans, Native Americans have been much more impacted from COVID than even African Americans and Latino Americans have. Let's look at what is it? What is it that do that? There are populations in the Caucasian community that live in socioeconomic disparity as well. And they don't have the rates of disease of the other demographics, the other groups such as Native Americans and African Americans and Latinos. And so there has to be something else at play here. And I would challenge the medical community, you know, why aren't we looking at this? You know, the field of genetics now is really introducing this idea of being able to figure out why things have happened in the past. You know, so we're able to look at the sickle cell gene and trace back its history, which is fascinating. You know, so we've always known sickle cell trait evolved to protect against malaria. So wherever malaria was endemic, in particular in Africa, the human body evolved and it developed a sickle cell trait in order to protect people from malaria. So we had this idea that it was protective, and so we just ran with that. And we never thought that maybe it might not be protective against other things. And so I believe COVID is one of those other things it is not protective against. And we've just got to look at that. So sorry, we had some technical difficulties starting our show, so my timing's a little bit off here, but I think we're about due for another commercial break. So when we come back, we'll talk about what people with sickle cell trait can do to protect themselves and what we can all do, because this is advice for everyone to protect themselves moving forward, because pandemics are unfortunately on the rise. They're going to become more frequent, and we need to begin to understand how we can protect ourselves and those of us who are most vulnerable moving forward. So we'll be right back. Thank you.
What happens when we begin to realize that the 200-year experiment we've called the American healthcare system has failed? Learn how spirituality, ancient traditions, and cutting-edge science are merging to create a new paradigm of wellness on Awakened Wellness with Mylaine Riobe, MD. Tune in every Wednesday at 12 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Time with live video shows every first and third Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern, when you can call in and ask Dr. Mylaine the questions that matter most to you. Dr. Mylaine is the medical director of the Riobe Institute of Integrative Medicine in Jupiter, Florida. For more information, visit RIOBE-integrativemedicine.com. Dream Vision 7 Radio Network invites you in for this dynamic, forward-thinking show.
EDECIA is a U.S. nonprofit dedicated to the dream of ending childhood malnutrition for millions of children around the world through the manufacture of Plumpy Nut and other nutrient-rich, peanut-based, ready-to-use foods. EDECIA has already delivered life and hope to nearly 1 million children in over 26 developing countries. To find out how you can join EDECIA's dream of ending childhood malnutrition, please visit edeciaglobal.org.
What if dreams can diagnose your life? What if we can meet the love of our life in dreams? Join host Kat O'Keefe-Canavis, the #1 internationally best-selling author of Dreams That Can Save Your Life, written with Duke University medical doctor Larry Burke. Dreaming Healing is where we'll explore dreams, research, and interpret dreams from you, the caller. Dreaming Healing shows can be heard every Tuesday at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern, with live shows on the first and third evening at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific Time on syndicated Dream Vision 7 Radio Network. Come live your dreams out loud with Kat.
Are you searching for a way to help create global change? Dream Vision 7 Radio Network's vision is to have an eclectic group of radio hosts dedicated to educating, enlightening, and helping humankind with positive messages and tools that enhance lives using different modalities and programs. If you would like to join our team and help illuminate the universe, call Deborah at 508-226-1723 or Deborah at dreamvision7radio.com.
This is Dream Vision 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax, and enjoy. Let life flow.
And we're back.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome back to Awakened Wellness. I'm your host, Dr. Mylaine Riobe, and we are live here on Dream Vision 7 Radio. Today we are talking about the link between COVID and sickle cell trait. And just wanted to talk a little bit about, what people with poor circulation can do. Whether it's sickle cell trait or it's diabetes or hypertension, heart disease. There are several other genetic types of conditions that people have that make them what we call hypercoagulable. And that means that their blood doesn't flow as smoothly for various reasons. And so some of the things we know that we can do is hydrate ourselves, right? So water is critically important for health, clean water. And there's a special kind of water that we call living water or phase 4 water. So if you look at water, it's fascinating. It's the only substance that we have, that we know of, that is in 3 phases, liquid, solid, and gas. And a 4th phase of water has been discovered. They call it phase 4 or living water, or what's called EZ water. Or exclusion zone water is what the EZ stands for. It's actually holy water. So in many churches, they have cisterns, and the water that is found there is different than the water that comes out of your faucet. So tap water is different than EZ water or phase 4 water. Phase 4 water is the configuration of water in the body. And it's got a different chemical structure. It's not H2O as we would recognize it. It's actually H3O2. And it's studied very well by Dr. Pollack up at the University of Washington, up in Washington State. He studied it for, I think, a couple decades plus. Those of us in the holistic community know of Dr. Emoto. He did, the famous studies on water. He passed away recently, but he was very instrumental in doing some research on water. And phase 4 water is critical because it is the healthiest kind of water that you can drink. It's different than alkalinized water. So this is ionized water. And so what's special about this water is it has more electrons in it, more hydrogen for electron exchange. And so that allows the body electric to function better, right? So if we look at the human body, it's 99% water by molecule. So in other words, 99% of the molecules that make up your entire body are water molecules. And by weight, when we step on a scale, 70% of our weight is water. So water is pretty important on the whole for us. And so the kind of water that we drink is critically important, right? And because our tap water gets processed so that, we don't drink bacteria and heavy metals and such, it is altered in its chemical structure for that reason. So it's not a bad idea to get your water to become phase 4 water. And Dr. Emoto did some interesting studies with thoughts and intention. And even just slapping a sticker on the water, the container that holds your water. And the 2 most powerful vibrations or sounds or thought patterns were love and gratitude. And he showed that it actually changed the configuration of the water. And how he showed that is if you look at the water under a very high-powered microscope, it would look like a snowflake. As opposed to tap water, if you were to do the same to tap water, put it under a very powerful microscope, it would look like a blob. It doesn't have the crystalline structure. It's not highly organized like phase 4 water. And so again, in the international literature, we're seeing a lot written about this. Here, not as much. Dr. Pollack is studying it at the University of Washington, but it's not well known. But if you look at the Earth naturally creates phase 4 water. So anything that goes in a toroid type of configuration can create phase 4 water. So the ocean waves, kind of create a phase 4 water. Now, I'm not suggesting you drink ocean water because that has other things, too much salt, etc. But the drinking water, water from clean sources like springs, etc. It goes around, it meanders, in a bit of a toroid type of configuration. And so that's being shown actually to structure water. And just really actually blessing your water can change its structure. So just, kind of having that intention of love and gratitude, and you're just kind of thanking your water for being there and being clean source for you. And it is being, that is what is being attributed to the impact of holy water that we've heard about, of course, for a couple thousand years now, is the fact that its configuration is different and it's more conducive to helping us to stay healthy. Infrared light will restructure the water in your body to make it phase 4. And that will help bring about health. So infrared light is known to help keep the body healthy for that reason. So water is critical. Sleep is another one, so for people who have sickle cell trait and anyone who has a hypercoagulable state or anyone who really actually wants to keep their circulation healthy, sleep is critically important. It's important to make sure that you get your 8 hours of sleep. If you are tired, if you've been under a lot of stress, you might need up to 9 hours of sleep a night. And it has to be consistent. It can't be you sleep in on a Saturday and you only get 5 hours for the rest of the week. It has to be consistently gaining that much rest. That helps to improve circulation because that's when the body restores itself. That's when the shelves get restocked, so to speak. So sleep is critical. And stress management is equally as important. So we went over heart math breathing, I believe, in the last podcast or perhaps the one before. But you can go to heartmath.org and they have what's called their quick coherence technique. You can also buy a sensor. They have a biofeedback sensor that you just plug in or sync with your phone. You can download their app called Inner Balance. From the App Store. It's free. And you can do what's called the quick coherence technique. It's a very quick 3-minute breathing exercise that has been studied for almost 30 years now and shown to help greatly mitigate the impact of stress. They have shown reductions of cortisol, which is the stress hormone, in people who are in what they call high coherence from having done the quick coherence technique. They have shown increases of what is coined the anti-aging hormone, DHEA, also made by the adrenal system, which is our stress handler. So DHEA has been shown to increase by as much as 100% from doing the quick coherence technique in studies. And so mitigating the impact of stress is another critically important thing. Of course, those things are easier said than done, right? So the most important thing is commitment. I always tell my clients, you have to become a student of what you want to be. You can't just come in and let me tell you everything, right? You have to actually want to learn about it and go and look, right? So you go on the Heart Math website and you can buy their books, you can watch their YouTube videos. You can look up Dr. Pollack and you can read his studies, and you can look up Dr. Emoto and read about it. You can look up sleep, and look at the latest research being done on sleep and how critically important it is, and immerse yourself in what you want to be. So if you want to be well, you have to be a student of wellness. That's my advice for everyone. I'm here to give you some guideposts and help you, but you're the one actually healing yourself at home, right? You're the one that has to actually do the work and make the commitment to do it. So I tell people, don't just rely on what I'm telling you. Go and look, go and immerse yourself, go and become a student and find reliable resources, trusted sources, and empower yourself. I think to be empowered is the greatest gift that we can give to ourselves, especially in these times, but in any time. So I think that about wraps it up, right? We're done. So again, I apologize. We had some technical difficulties, so my timing's a bit off. I hope you are still able to get a lot out of today's podcast. And I thank you as always for being here. I send you many blessings and love, and wish you and your family just all the best during this time until we can reemerge in our new normal. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.
Join us next time on Awakened Wellness with Mylaine Riobe, MD, to learn how spirituality, ancient traditions, and cutting-edge science are merging to create a new paradigm of wellness. Awakened Wellness airs every Wednesday at 12 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Time, with live video shows every first and third Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern of each month. Meanwhile, you can join our Facebook page at facebook.com/awakenedwellness and let us know what you'd like to discuss on future episodes. Dr. Mylaine is the medical director of the Riobe Institute of Integrative Medicine in Jupiter, Florida. For more information, visit riobeintegrativemedicine.com. This show is part of the Dream Vision 7 radio network.
This is Dream Vision 7 Radio Network, uniting mankind with universal love. Our shows are created from the heart, bringing each listener to a place of divine enlightenment. Breathe, relax, and enjoy. Let life flow.